Really
How are you?
He knows about it.
Cody? 1:30? 1:30 we stop? We're ready? Let's go. Hello?
There is a sign-up sheet that we're passing around at the moment, so if you wouldn't mind just writing your name and unit or department you're coming from, we'd appreciate it. So good afternoon and thank you for joining us. My name is Cody Case. I'm from International Programs and kind of co-organized this event with the Office of Multicultural Affairs. I really just booked the room. Briefly, if you missed our International Workshop series in July, if you go to our International Programs website, you can actually see those in video, just like today. I'm going to record this workshop, and we're going to have it available so you can share it with any of your colleagues or the units, whoever you'd like. So if you go to OIP, up in the top right, there's International Resources page. And we'll also provide this to Office of Multicultural Affairs, so you guys can put it on your website too.
Cool. Only if it comes out well.
Yeah. We'll have to, do some edit. But briefly, I wanted to just provide you with a biography for Mr. Blane Harding, who's going to lead the workshop today. So, Blane currently serves as the Director of Office of Multicultural Affairs at KU. He's also a consultant for private companies and has worked with over 30 institutions of higher learning across the country. He retired from Colorado State University in 2012, where he served as the Director of Advising, Recruitment, and Retention for the College of Liberal Arts. Harding has taught courses in African American history and ethnic studies for the past 21 years. He received his BA in Interdisciplinary Communication from SUNY Rockport and his MA in 19th Century American History from Colorado State University. He also serves as a retention faculty member with the Council for Opportunity in Education that oversees the National TRIO programs. He's a faculty member and past chair of the Summer Institute Advisory Board for the National Academic Advising Association, as well as the former chair of the Multicultural Concerns Commission. Mr. Harding has published several articles on diversity, multicultural advising, and advisor training, and is presented at national conferences on various topics that focus on African American, Latino and Latina, biracial, Native American, and Asian Pacific Islander students in higher education. He has received too many awards for me to list at this time, so without further ado, please welcome Mr. Harding.
Thank you. Can you all tell that I wrote that? Okay. Just want to make sure we're clear on what we're doing here today. This really doesn't focus on international students, although you can use this information for international students. And it's going to take a little different focus when it comes to talking about cultural competency and what cultural competency really means. And what I mean by that, when we talk about cultural competency, we're always talking about it externally. We're always talking about it in terms of African American students, or Asian American students, or Latino, Hispanic students, Native students. So we always refer to it externally, and we focus on their culture and how we have to understand their culture. And I don't care how long you've been doing this work, I don't care how many workshops you've actually attended, there's no way you're going to understand every single individual's culture that's actually out there. And when you really take a look at it, and you take a look at third, fourth, fifth generation African American, Asian, and Latino students that are coming to the campus, and not just this campus, but campuses across the country, in their third and fourth generation, is their culture that drastically different than American culture? Is their culture that drastically different than what we would call mainstream culture? And there are some things that we can point to, and those things are really important because they're part of their identity. But the real question that we don't ask enough is, how do I need to change? How do I understand cultural competency? How do I understand what my privileges are? And how many people in the room have been to a presentation on privilege? How many of you have been to a presentation that it solely focuses on white privilege? And then we give people the idea that the only privilege that exists is white privilege. And that's an important conversation to have, but there's so many other forms of privilege that can get in the way of us actually relating to the students that we're actually serving, or even relating to the individuals that are in our office. And I don't care what your position is at this university, I don't care where you're at in your professional career, we're all in the business of building relationships with students. That's the bottom line. And when you're talking about diverse students, that's what keeps diverse students at the institution. There are a lot of institutions that have tutoring and supplemental instruction and living learning communities and writing centers, and they're all really important for students academically, and they're all really important for that transition from high school to college, but really what gets in the way is what I would define as campus environment. Is the campus environment open to students? Are people building relationships with students? So once again, how many people have been to diversity training? Raise your hand high. How many people that have been to diversity training will not go again? Honestly, we go there and people are afraid. People are really afraid of the idea of change. It scares the heck out of people because they think when you change things, they have to lose something and somebody else is going to gain something. And that doesn't have to be the way it is. Just because we're changing things doesn't mean you're losing anything. We just have a better way of actually going about it. So to indicate that, change can be a very, very good thing. Okay? That's me in 4th grade. That's me in 1975 when I graduated from high school. Thank God I don't have the afro. Not that I could grow it again, but thank God I don't have it. And that's my picture when I started here. So when you talk about diversity training and you talk about it, there are some really key concepts that you have to understand. The first one is you got to treat the individual within a cultural context. Okay? How many people know African American students who don't identify as being African American? How many people know Asian students that don't identify as being Asian? And Latino students and Native students, but automatically some individuals that are on positions on campuses across the country automatically go into their black mode when they've got an African American student in front of them. Is that a true statement? Anybody in the room not know what I'm talking about? My daughter was on a traveling soccer and basketball team from 7th to 9th grade. I was the only black parent that was actually there. So at the beginning of every single game, one of the white fathers who wanted me to be comfortable, wanted me to fit in, would actually go about doing this. Hope your daughter has a good game. Hope your daughter has a good game. He'd get to me and he'd do this. Yo, bro, what's up? It's like, what the hell is that? Where'd that come from? Okay? He thought that was being culturally competent. He thought that that was making me feel comfortable as the only black parent there, and all it did was upset the other parents because they understood that that's not the right approach. So we really have to take a look at the language we use, and we really have to take a look at ourselves. So there's 2 things we're going to be doing today, and hopefully everybody has a pen. I've only got 50 copies, so you might have to share it, but it will be on the big screen. I want everybody to do a self-evaluation of where they're at. I want everybody to take a look at the person next to them and figure it out. So we're going to do exercises over the past hour and a half, because only a couple people in the room are here to listen to me talk for an hour and a half. Right, Dr. Tidwell? All right, okay? So we're going to be doing different activities so that we can understand where we're at and we can actually gauge our cultural competency. So if you have any questions whatsoever, please just let me know. Transitions for diverse students. Somebody give me some of the transitions diverse students have to make when they come to college. This is the participatory part, okay? And I know some folks in the audience, I'll just shout out names if I have to, all right? Yes, ma'am.
They may be coming out of a community that was full of many people
Okay.
who they related to
In a cultural way.
level, and they come here and cannot.
And they can't relate. Or another way of saying that, they may come from a community that looks like themselves to a campus that does not look like themselves. And they're making that adjustment. That's not an academic adjustment. That's a social and cultural adjustment that they're actually making to campus. Somebody else give me some transitions for diverse students.
Understanding the accent.
Understanding the accent. We're talking about international students, but we're also talking about some domestic students that don't understand that language. And sometimes the language that we use is really offensive in my position. It's really offensive. How many people have worked with at-risk students? Raise your hand, okay? So, you come to campus, and I approach you from an office, and the first thing I say to you is, we got this great at-risk program for you that's going to make you successful. What's the first thing that hits you? What did I just tell that student? We just told them that they're probably going to fail, but we're going to make sure to the best of our ability that we're going to give them all the support that's necessary for them to succeed. Why don't we change that language? Instead of calling students at risk, we call them rising potential students. That there is a potential that we're going to tap into, and you're going to do the best you can given what you're bringing to the university and what the university can provide for you. So sometimes it's just a matter of the language that we're using that becomes offensive for some students. And students, especially from diverse backgrounds, and correct me if I'm wrong, have different attitudes towards help-seeking behavior. Is that a true statement? They have different attitudes. Some students will not ask for help because it's a sign of weakness. Some students will not ask for help from a cultural perspective because they've been told they've got to lift themselves up by the bootstraps. And quite frankly, some students won't ask for help because they don't want to live down to the stereotype. When I got there, they told me I needed help. So now I'm not going to ask for help because I'm going to do it on my own, because if I ask for help, I'm actually proving them right. Different reasons why, but they have different attitudes. When you take a look at it, the first students experience the transition to college not only as an adjustment to their academic environment, but also adjustment to the social and cultural environment. They've got to make sure they understand what that new culture is and that campus culture and how they fit into that campus culture. That's one of the reasons we have an Office of Multicultural Affairs. It's a home away from home for that student population to feel comfortable from a social and cultural perspective. It's also a way for them to get more involved, not that they can't get involved in Greek life or student senate or any of the other activities, but they want to make sure they're connecting in the same way they connected in their communities. When you take a look at it, key aspect is validation. We want to make sure we validate their students. Anybody in this room not want validation? We all want it. We always want that. We want to make sure that we understand that we're welcome and understand that we also fit into the institution. And you've got to change campus culture in order for that to occur. And when you take a look at rules and regulations and the new core and bold aspirations and all the other changes that have happened at KU, the most difficult thing to do on college campuses is to change the culture of that campus. Because every single individual has to change. Every single individual has to adjust. I just came from Florida, and I mentioned that to a group of 130 academic advisors. One of them raised their hand and said this: I know the best way and the only way to change culture on a college campus. So I thought he had the magic bullet. So like a fool, I called on him and said, could you please yell out what you're talking about? And he said, the way to change campus culture is one grave at a time. And that's what everybody in the room did too. That's not the only way to change culture, but that's his perspective of how you change culture. That as people die off, you replace them with people that are open to the new cultural ideas. That's not what we want to do here. I'm not asking anybody to die off, but I am asking people to make adjustments in how we actually do our jobs and do our positions, to make sure that our space is open and welcoming to students regardless of what those students' backgrounds are. Does that make sense to everybody? So we've got to make sure that that validation for students in this new space is very opening and welcoming for those students. Diverse student challenges. Their presence on campus is often scrutinized. Everybody tell me why it's scrutinized. Well, some diverse students here on college campuses are what generally are defined as PWIs, predominantly white institutions. How is their experience they're scrutinized? How are they scrutinized? Anyone? Yes, ma'am.
Like maybe if someone is the only Hispanic student in the room or
That's right.
a black student, they might, like other students might look to the student. So what's the black perspective?
That's right. What's the black perspective? How many people in the room that are African American or Latino or Asian or Native have been asked for that? What's the black community think? I don't know. Let me look them all up. After I get done calling them, I'll let you know. Okay? But sometimes that is scrutinized. Sometimes it's affirmative action that scrutinizes that. You're here because of affirmative action reasons, and you've actually taken the place of somebody who is more qualified than you are. I don't know how many black students and Hispanic students have been asked this question. What sport do you play? Okay? That's scrutinizing them. I call those microaggressions, because those are the things that are getting in the way of those students really feeling comfortable, because people don't know the language to use for those particular students. So it's not just training of faculty, it's not just training of staff, it's not just training of administrators, it's also training of the entire student body to be more open. Quick story. In my office about 2 months ago, an African student from Nigeria walks into the office and talks to my assistant and says, I need to talk to somebody in this office because I was over in the rec center and something happened to me. She didn't quite know what to do with him, so she sent him into my office. He sat down and I said, what's going on here? He was on a treadmill in the student rec center. A white student was on a treadmill right next to him, bent over, looked at him and said this: I didn't know they let monkeys in here. He was devastated. I mean, simply devastated. He came to my office. I talked to him a little about race relations in the country, talked to him about language and so forth and so on. He felt a little better about himself. I've been meeting with him once a week since that time that he came into my office. And sometimes, once again, language gets in the way. Last time he came to my office and he's taking driver ed because he doesn't have a driver's license, the driver's ed instructor said this: when you're out on the road, you really got to watch out for black ice. Because he had experienced negative reactions and negative race interactions, he thought that the term black ice was referring to him and referring to black people. And then I had to explain to him what that actually meant. He currently has about a dozen of my books that he's actually reading up on this, and he wanted to leave. There's one time he came to my office and said, I don't like myself anymore. And this is a quality student that's in a graduate program from another country that did not feel comfortable. He's still here because he got connected with other African students during that summer. So he's doing much, much better, but those type of things should not occur to any student. I don't care what your background is, because it's got to be that open campus environment, okay? Their talents and abilities are doubted. Cognitive mapping, sometimes don't understand the nature of higher education and what's expected of them, and the sense of attachment to the institution needs to be there. One of the best retention tools we have is connecting students to individual programs on campus, so that they're vested in those programs regardless of what those programs are. It's not just the academic support, it's the social and cultural support that sometimes these students are lacking. So we've got to make sure that we're being proactive and not reactive. And one way to be proactive is to have more sessions like this, quite frankly, where people can come and share ideas and get a greater understanding, because a lot of people will go to other people of different cultures, and that's fine, that's one way to do it, but we need to move from being culturally aware to culturally competent. People know what I mean by that? What's cultural awareness? What's prejudice? It's a thought. What's discrimination? It's an action. Cultural awareness is a thought. I know a lot of people that are culturally aware. I know a lot of people that study it, a lot of people that can write on it, a lot of people that can have conversations with it, but they can't leverage it. They can't put it in place. And once you begin to leverage it, that becomes cultural competency. So just because you studied it, just because you got an A on an exam, does not mean you are culturally competent. And we'll talk about that, because how many people have had a conversation with themselves and said, where am I in terms of my cultural competency? Anybody? How did you measure it? Okay, how did you measure where you were in terms of your cultural competency? A lot of people will say, I'm not there, I'm there. I'm doing better. That's no measurement. You've got to be able to measure it, and I'll show you a chart that I created so you can actually figure out exactly where you are, and then we'll have a discussion over where you want to be and how do you get there. It's really important that you can get there no matter where you are, and everybody has different places that they want to be. It's kind of like Maslow's scale of hierarchical needs. How many people have reached self-actualization? All right, we talk about it, but I think part of it is the journey, not just the fact that you actually have reached it. So let's talk about that in a couple minutes as well, and we want to make sure that they have academic, social, and personal emotional adjustments. African American students around this country with high GPAs are just as likely to drop out of school as African American students in this country with low GPAs. What's that tell anybody in the room?
It's not about grades.
It's not about grades. It's not about academic abilities. It's about fit and making sure that they're fit. As he said earlier, I worked at Colorado State University, not a very diverse university. I don't know how many students left and went to Metro State that's in Denver. And Metro State has open admissions. They're not competitive at all, but they felt much more comfortable there regardless of what degree in the institution they were going to get that degree from. So very oftentimes it becomes part of that campus environment that we need to make sure that we're adjusting. Students are more likely to drop out if, and I'm talking about students in general, but particularly students of color. Give me some factors as to why students drop out besides campus environment and fit. Characteristics that they might possess. Anybody? First generation students? How many people in the room are first generation? How many people in the room struggled being first generation because you didn't understand the nature of higher education? 1975, my parents, who never went to college, never stepped foot on a college campus, sent me to North Carolina State. First generation student, they knew nothing about it except they put me on a plane. I got off in Raleigh, went to my dorm room, called up my mother on a payphone for you younger folks, okay? This was 1975, there were no cell phones. Called them up and told my mother that they did not supply me with sheets, blankets, and pillows. She was livid. She goes, how much am I paying for room and board and they couldn't even give you a sheet? You gotta be kidding me. How would she know that? She's never been in college. And that's something simple, let alone understanding what credit hours are, understanding what the difference is between a major, minor, and certificate, even understanding what an academic advisor can provide for you. They don't understand that at all. They think that academic advisors are just schedule writers, and if that's all you're doing as an academic advisor, I hate to say it, get another job, because you're really not doing your job. So we've got to make sure we're making those students welcome. Other answers to this question. Students are more likely to drop out if they
Don't make personal connections.
are male, are poor, don't make first connections, have non-traditional characteristics such as these. We're not just talking about adult learners. To me, there is a difference between an adult learner and a non-traditional student. A 19-year-old student with a 2-year-old child is not an adult learner, but they are non-traditional. So we need to make sure that we understand even the language that we use in terms of the definitions that we give to students. They delayed entry to college and parents. A lot of diverse students delay entry. We have more percentage-wise diverse students at two-year schools in this country than we have at four-year schools in this country. Far more Black and Latino students that are in that transition. They've gone to two-year schools, dropped out, and then went back to four-year schools, then dropped out, then went back again because of outside responsibilities. And that doesn't just apply to diverse students, it also applies to white European students, but when you take a look at the percentages are much greater for diverse students in this country to fit that particular profile. They're part-time, they earned a GED, they're single. Some other ideas. Behavior of ending students, more likely to drop out if they're academically underprepared. If they're working a lot of students have to work. Every study I've ever seen indicates that students that are working about 15 hours, that's probably where students should be. Students that are working over 20 hours, they just have too much on their plate. And students, anybody work with students that don't have a job? Sometimes they think they've got all the time in the world. So they procrastinate, and they don't get their things done because they don't have to have good time management, at least they don't think they have to have good time management. But this is just some profile of what you're talking about in terms of them. Especially that second one from the bottom, don't get involved in different activities. So if a student comes to you, regardless of what their background is, I've had advisors, I've had people that I've worked with because I do things at different campuses. If a Latino student comes to them and says, I need to get involved on campus because I haven't found my place on campus, what's the first thing they say to that student? You know, we've got a HALO organization, Hispanic American Leadership Organization. What if that student was interested in Greek life? What if that student was interested in the Senate? In other words, we've got to have conversations with students to find out who they are, because the absolute most important aspect of any diversity training, and I'll say this over and over, is to treat the individual within a cultural context. Once you understand that individual, then you can move to that culture if you have to. You don't always have to move to that culture. It's that individual relationship that they're looking for. And a lot of diverse students are what I would call relational learners. If they've got a relationship with the person in front of the room, or they've got a relationship with some person on that campus, they're going to try harder because they know that that person has got their back, is in their corner. We've got to make sure that we're building it. And you do not have to look like a student to be a mentor for that student. I'm so tired of hearing people say that. Not that we couldn't increase the Black faculty, not that we couldn't increase the Latino faculty, but just think of it. I don't even know what the number is. Say we have 50 African American faculty members on this campus. Are they supposed to actually adhere to all of the diverse students on campus that are coming to them? And some places have that. I did a consult in Pennsylvania where if you were a Black student, you went to the Black advisor. If you were a Latino student, you went to the Latino advisor, and they brought me in because they were having a fit because that Black advisor retired and they couldn't find anybody to take his place. And I walked in there and I said, hire somebody else. No, that consult was really easy for me, believe me. But people don't think of it that way. They think that you got to look like the person. I would rather, I've got 4 children, I would rather somebody that cared about my children, was concerned about my children, and want my children to be successful, to be their mentor, as opposed to somebody that looked like them that was just walking through the paces. Anybody can be a mentor for anyone, but we've got to break patterns, and I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. Because who do we tend to mentor? And who tends to mentor us? Anybody? People that look just like us. And I'll give you a example of it in just a moment that I probably use 40 different times, and the result is always the same. There's always 1 or 2 people that don't fit the pattern, but most of us fit that pattern. So we've got to make sure we're breaking away from those concepts. Pick a state where you're from, or any state. This map is put out by the Department of Education, and it represents children K through 12 who are minority children. I don't really like the word minority. Are women a minority in this country? They're not a minority, but they are minoritized. There's a difference between those two concepts. But this map represents the number of diverse students K through 12 that go to a school that's at least 90% minority. Okay? I was born and raised in New York, 55.3%. California, 38.8%. My former state of Colorado, 16%. What happens to those students when they come to campus and they don't see people that look like themselves? Now all of a sudden they're concerned that maybe I'm not welcome there. Maybe I don't fit there. Maybe people don't want me there. Only state that doesn't have it is Vermont at 0.0%. Is it New Hampshire? New Hampshire is 0. There you go. Lucky to say that geography test there, right? The only state that doesn't have it is New Hampshire. And I always make a joke, and don't take this personal. The reason New Hampshire doesn't have it is because the only color in New Hampshire are the leaves changing in the fall. Okay? But my point is making sure that we understand that. The students are coming to us from a variety of different backgrounds and coming to a campus where they're looking for somebody to mentor them. They're looking for their place. They're looking for the fit. looking to make sure that they're welcome, and it happens in almost every single state in the union. And some of them are worse than others because we are a very multicultural country. Anybody deny that? We are a very diverse country, and nobody can deny that, but we're also a very segregated country when it actually comes to race and class. Very segregated when it comes to both of those. So we want to make sure that we understand that so we can change that so we can welcome students that are coming to our campus. Paulo Freire said it best, and I won't read all this to you. I'll have you read that. Anybody in the room not have baggage? And I'm not talking about luggage, I'm talking about baggage, okay? We all do. We all bring certain things. We all bring certain things in place, but we've got to make sure that we understand that. They're living and the importance of the knowledge derived from life experience which they bring with them to school. We're not starting over from zero. We're starting over with people that already have this experience. It's up to us to have a better understanding of what that experience is. Not that we need to walk in other people's shoes, and when you talk about that, I don't quite understand what people mean, but we've got to have an understanding of that experience. How many people in the room, for example, have heard of the concept that you need to step outside your comfort zone? Okay? What happens at the end of the day? You step back in. I used to belong to the President's Minority Student Advisory Committee at my former institution, and Dr. Yates is the most intimidating, intelligent man I've ever seen in my life. When he said something, everybody jumped, and everybody wanted to impress this man because he was so intelligent. So we had 50 students around the room, and he simply made this statement. I want each and every one of you to tell us how you're going to step outside your comfort zone. So we're all putting on our thinking caps. We really want to impress Dr. Yates so he remembers who we are. Gets to this international student that didn't understand the culture of the campus, and she said this to Dr. Yates. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I thought the room was going to implode when she said that. All of a sudden, everybody just grabbed the people's arm next to him and went, I can't believe she talked to Dr. Yates that way. Pulled his glasses down and said, young lady, what does that mean? She said, why would I want to step outside my comfort zone? Because at the end of the day, I'm going to step inside my comfort zone. Why wouldn't I want to expand my comfort zone so I'm comfortable around no matter who it is, whether I know their culture or not? So what's Dr. Yates say? Brilliant idea. So what do the rest of us say? Damn, I thought I had a really good answer. And I had to be next in line, didn't I? So I just kind of babbled to Dr. Yates. So that was my impression with Dr. Yates babbling in front of him going, who is she to say that, okay? She had a perfect example. We want to expand that comfort zone. I do not have to know students' culture in order for me to be comfortable around them. I'm going to learn it, I'm going to try and learn it, I'm going to get to the point where I know it as well as I can, but that's not a prerequisite to get along with students. There are basically 4 things that y'all need to know, and it's awareness, knowledge, and skills we'll start out with. What do you need awareness of when you're working with diverse populations? What do you need awareness of? Anybody? How they identify themselves? Do all diverse students identify themselves the same? And don't we make assumptions about students and their identities on a regular basis? I was born and raised in New York. When I was in New York, what was I? I was a Puerto Rican, okay? I moved to Florida and roofed houses in the late 1970s, and when I was in Florida, what was I? I was a Cuban. Moved to Colorado, started teaching African American history in 1991. A group of students in the back of the room talked all the while I was actually presenting. 3rd week into the campus, I said, could you guys come forward after class and talk to me? And I said, what's going on here, guys? They said, nothing against you, Mr. Harding. We're just mad at Colorado State University. And I said, why? They said, why would they hire a Mexican to teach African American history? Okay? So I have been a Puerto Rican, I have been a Cuban, and I have been a Mexican in my lifetime. None of them ever asked me what I was. Because we make assumptions, and we place labels, and we place identity on different people. I'm black and Italian. My grandmother's name is Santina Angelina Vigliotti. Doesn't get any more Italian than that, believe me. But nobody ever bothered to ask. We can't make those assumptions. Their identity is not our choice. Their identity is their choice. And if they choose to identify that way, then we need to accept it. I have 4 children. My children are black, Italian, Irish, English, and French Canadian. If I brought my 4 children in here, you wouldn't even think they were related, and 2 of them are twins. My son Christopher identifies as being black. He's into hip-hop music. My daughter Marie identifies as being biracial and a lesbian. My daughter Tony identifies as being Mexican, even though she's not Mexican. She's fluent in Spanish, and she loves Mexican boys, okay? And my son Kyle, who has an afro bigger than the one you saw on the first screen, identifies as being white. I have absolutely no problem with that. I went to a football practice when my son Kyle was in 8th grade, tapped him on the shoulder and said, Kyle, I'm going to be over by the fence. Come and get me after this. One of his buddies who'd never seen me before turned to my son and said, "Oh my God, your dad's black." And Kyle said, "I'm black." And he said, "No, you're not." And they argued for 5 minutes over whether or not my child was actually black. Did not allow him to identify himself. And eventually they got to the point where I thought his buddy was going to give up, and he said this to my son: "There's no shame in being adopted." Okay? Still didn't allow him to be who he was. So we need to understand it is not our decisions, it's their decisions. And the reason I know that my daughter, Tony, likes Mexican boys is that I have a 16-month-old granddaughter who is black, Italian, Irish, English, French, Canadian, and Mexican. Okay? We've got to make sure that they have the ability to identify themselves. It's really important that we understand that. Okay? Mentoring goals. These are the objectives. I don't care what your position is on campus. These are the objectives that all of us have. Number one objective is to create a supportive environment, to make sure people feel welcome, to make sure they're comfortable. Once people are comfortable and welcoming, then we can actually do the things that we need to do. And there is a huge, huge difference, and I'll talk about this in just a second, between equality and equity. Are we looking to gain equality, or are we looking to gain equity? We first have to have equity if we want equality. You can't start out with equality, and I'll explain that in just a second. You have to have equity. You've got to have fairness. You've got to have equality of opportunities, not equality of results, but equality of opportunities. That comes with equity. And as soon as you've established equity, then you can move towards everybody is same, and sameness, which is equality. So we want to create that environment. We want to enhance integration. We want diverse students to be integrated as possible into the campus life. And some people mistake integration for assimilation. I'm not asking anybody to assimilate. That's up to you if you want to assimilate. And if that's your choice, that's fine. I'm asking for integration, which is opening up institutional structures so we do have equality of opportunity within those structures. Assimilation is losing your culture and taking on the dominant group, which is perfectly acceptable if that's your choice. But once again, it comes down to choice. We want to improve graduation rates. How many people in here over the past, we'll just pick 6 months, haven't heard the word retention, haven't heard the word persistence, haven't heard the term graduation rates? Anybody in the room not heard that? If you haven't heard it, you've probably been on vacation for 6 months, okay? We talk about that all the time. The best way is to make sure students are comfortable and we have relationships with those students. If a student has a relationship with somebody on campus, the possibility of them staying and graduating has been drastically increased. They have somebody to go to. They have somebody that's going to support them. They have somebody that can explain the system. You know, I've been in higher education for 25 years. I still don't understand the system. We've got to actually make referrals to people that have better knowledge than us, and we've got to be willing to do that. We're not the end-all, be-all, and eventually we want to foster those relationships, okay? More effective advocates. Why do we need, let me ask you, why do we need diversity training? Obviously to be more effective advocates, but what does it do for us? What does it allow us to do because we've been to a diversity or multicultural, however you want to define it. I know some people are really opposed to the term diversity training. We'll have diversity discussions. What does it do for us?
Become more flexible.
We become more flexible. We become more flexible because we're knowledgeable. What else does it do? Does it increase the possibility we can build relationships with students that are different than us? There's that awareness and that knowledge. And then we've got to have the skills to actually apply it, but there's one term that people always miss when they talk about it. And I've been to so many presentations where they talk about the awareness, they talk about the knowledge, and they talk about the skills, but they miss one term that is even more important than awareness, knowledge, and skills. Anybody in the room never hear the Aretha Franklin song? R-E-S-P-E-C-T. Anybody in the room not hear that song? I've yet to meet anybody, you've never heard? Oh, she's scratching. Don't move. Lord, I was going to say, that's the first person in my life that never heard the R-E-S-P-E-C-T song. And Tamara's going to sing it for us. Just kidding, okay? Somebody was clapping over here, all right? But we've got to have respect for the students. If you don't have awareness, and you don't have knowledge, and even if you lack the skills to apply it, if you've got respect for students, students are going to have respect for you, which means you're allowed to make mistakes. And how many people you know are really fearful of interacting with students that are different from them because they don't want to make mistakes. They don't want to be offensive. If you've got the respect of students, you're allowed to make those type of mistakes. Because there's one word that almost everybody in this country does not want to be called, and that's called racist. Even the Klan doesn't want to be called racist. They've changed their attitude around, so now they're for white power. They're for white pride. They're still racist, okay? But they've changed their language around because nobody wants to be called that. If you've got respect for students, once again, it allows you to make mistakes. It allows you to do that because they know you still have their best interest in mind. You just don't have the knowledge that's necessary for you to actually apply it from a skills perspective. We've got to learn from our students. We've got to allow our students to tell their stories because their stories are important and their stories are who they are, but very oftentimes we don't cut out a space for students to tell those stories. And they think their stories can only be told inside the classroom. There's more stories told outside the classroom than there is inside the classroom. That space also has to be conducive to them. Better understanding of diverse populations. That's what this actually does for you. Increased credibility, trust, and effectiveness. The more you know, the more effective you're going to be. The more you know, the more trusting your students are going to be. And the more you know, the more respect the students are going to have for you. We're constantly trying to change. We're constantly trying to increase our knowledge in these areas. We want to strengthen relationships. That one should have actually been first, because that's what it's all about to me, are the relationships that we build on campus. Can anybody in this room do their job effectively if you don't have relationships? We all have relationships with different units, different departments, different folks across campus. You know, some people call it bridges. I really don't like the concept of bridges, because bridges are here and you're over there, and when do you cross that bridge? When you want something. Anybody not gotten this infamous email during your career? Somebody you haven't seen in 3-4 years writes you an email and says, you know, Sarah, I haven't seen you in a while. It's really nice. I hope your family's doing well. You know, I hope school's treating you well. I hope your position's really nice. What's that next line? Oh, by the way, the real reason I'm writing is, okay? Those are bridges. We don't want to build those bridges. We want to build coalitions so that we're actually celebrating everybody's accomplishments. So they understand what everybody's doing. We're not just going across that bridge when we need something. We're actually working together. So if a diverse student comes to you and says, Daniel helped me out. Daniel was fantastic. He allowed me to see things differently and so forth and so on. We generally sit with that student and say, oh, that's fantastic, that's awesome, we're really glad Daniel helped you. How many of you would send Daniel an email and say, you know what students just told me about you? How many people do that? Not a lot. That's not where we should be. I should inform Daniel, thank you very much because you helped the student out. Even more importantly, this student thanked you when you weren't even present because you really made an impact in that student's lives. Share that information. Make sure other people on campus know that. Or else people stop doing those things because everybody wants to be recognized. We need to make sure we recognize them. Even if it's the smallest thing, we want to make sure that we're recognizing the work that they're actually doing. Okay? Ability to increase our own cultural awareness and competency. And develop successful working relationships with individuals that fit not our, but fit their cultural world, their cultural lens, their cultural perspective. Once again, we don't have to change who we are, we just might have to change a little bit of how we operate. Maybe a little bit of the language that we actually use as individuals and from an institutional standpoint. And when we talk about culture, what are we really talking about? Somebody give me aspects of culture. What are the two most safe aspects of culture you can think about? Language, and that's not safe because some people are opposed to language. Some people are opposed to folks that speak in Ebonics, African American Vernacular English, for example. Some people think that when you speak that you're not very intelligent, that you're not very capable. It's kind of like people that have a really strong Southern accent. What do a lot of people think once they start talking? Anybody? You're dumb. That you don't understand it, that you can't speak proper English. So I'm not just talking about that, but what are two really safe aspects of culture? Food. Food is the most safe, even the Klan eats tacos. I mean, it is the safest aspect of culture you could possibly think about because it's not offensive. Music. A lot of people listen to different musics. What are those other aspects of culture that you want to know about?
Traditions.
Traditions. What are their traditions? What is their family structure like? What is their family relationships like? Anybody else? What are their ideas? What are their values? What are their mores? What is their religion? You know, we oftentimes assume, and we'll do an exercise in a second, I promise you, but we oftentimes assume when we come in contact with a student, religious-wise, what are they? They gotta be Christian. We live in the United States. They're all Christians. Okay, I did a session in Colorado Springs about 2 years ago, and I did a diversity wheel that we'll do in just a second. And this woman was working with this other woman named Martinez. And then they showed each other what they had there. And what did she put down religious-wise for Miss Martinez? Catholic. She was Catholic. The woman was Jewish. But she had a heck of a time trying to convince the other woman that she was Jewish. She kept saying, you can't be, you're Martinez. And I mean, they went at it, and the whole room just stopped while they talked. And she did not allow her to be Jewish, as if she had a choice to allow her to do something. She was just making the assumption that she was Catholic because she's Miss Martinez. Miss Martinez could be anything, okay? So we can't make those type of assumptions once again. This is what it comes down to for me. It's not the figment of the pigment, it's the enigma of the stigma, okay? Somebody paraphrase that for us. It's not the figment of the pigment, it's the enigma of the stigma. What does that mean? Anybody?
It's not what you think about the color of
Say it a little louder.
It's not what you think about the color of their skin, but the ideas,
That's right.
the judgments that you
The ideas, the judgments, the barriers you place in front of them because of the color of their skin. That's what it all comes down to. It all comes down to those type of assumptions that we're making because of how people look, how people carry themselves, not who they are inside, not their values, not their ideas, but it's just that physical impression, and all of a sudden, that alone can become a barrier for many of the students that we're actually serving. So it's not the figment of the pigment, it's the enigma of the stigma. For the longest time I claimed that till my wife told me I couldn't. It comes from Glenn Lowry. She actually looked it up for me and said, you better give credit to somebody because that's not your statement. I said, but everybody I've talked to thinks I came up with it. It's great, okay? This is what I'm talking about here. Anybody not see this before? This is the difference between equality and equity. Equity is fairness, access to same opportunities. Equality is sameness, giving the same thing to everybody, okay? How many people have multiple children in the room? Okay? How many people in the room want to treat everybody equal? Does that mean you treat them the same? How many people, again, have multiple children? You treat all your children the same? But you treat your children equally?
Yes.
You sure do, according to what they want. When my two sons, who are 20 years old now, live with me after I got divorced, my son Christopher, and he's changed, was the most immature 18-year-old I've ever seen in my life. My son Kyle, and not just because he's my son, was the most mature 18-year-old I've ever seen in my life. I came back from a presentation one day and Kyle asked me how I did, and I said, awesome, fantastic, it went really great. He looked at me and he said this, Dad, overconfidence is the alcohol of the fool. Okay? I was like, whoa, where'd that come from, dude? But they're very different, and I treat them equally. So when I was leaving to do consulting work, my son Christopher automatically packed his bag because he knew he was going to his mother's house. I would never, ever leave him there by himself because I would not have a home when I came back. My son Kyle, when I came back, the yard was cut, the laundry was done, the house was clean. I treat them equally, but I didn't treat them the same, I treated them differently. This is what this is saying. We can treat people equal, but we got to treat them different. And different according to what? Their needs, their desires, where they are intellectually. And a lot of people have a problem with that because they think that statement only applies to students of color. University of Kansas. Do we treat athletes differently? Okay. Do we treat honor students differently? Do we treat people, and you just name a category, they're all treated differently according to what they want. So this concept doesn't only apply to students of color, even though that's what people generally think. It applies across the board because we want to make sure we're meeting the needs of all the students, and not all the students have the same needs. I used to be an academic advisor, and I knew people that used to go into academic advising, and the advisor thought they had to treat everybody equal, so they'd start from page 1, 45 minutes later, they've told the student what they wanted. And then they asked the student, do you have any questions? And all the student wanted was their advising code. Okay? But they had to go through 45 minutes of listening to that because they didn't find out what the needs of that student were. We've got to make sure that we understand those particular needs. Okay? There are barriers to success. Okay? I'm going to pass these out. I'm sorry I only have 50, and I think that's fantastic. Y'all ought to give yourself a round of applause. I never thought this room was going to be full for this presentation, but I'm really happy that you're all here. Round of applause. Okay? I'm going to pass these out. You can share some of these with your neighbor. Could you help me out, man? Okay. If you want to pass those out, because these are the forms that we're going to use, because I think it's important that you all fill out the information. The information doesn't come from me. So as soon as those are handed out, I just want to talk a little bit about these 4 concepts that can serve as barriers for our students. Okay? And if you turn it over on the back, I didn't go in order, that's the first one. So as a group, and I'll just throw some of those up there for you. There are, and if anybody wants any of these, and you can use these for staff development, especially a couple of those we're going to use. They're fantastic for staff development, for people to have a better idea of where they're at. There are individual barriers. There are group barriers. There are institutional barriers. And there are systematic barriers, or systemic barriers. So somebody give me an example of an individual barrier that might get in the way of a student of color being successful.
Personal experience.
Personal experiences. So maybe microaggressions, personal experiences. Individual prejudice and discrimination would get in the way. Somebody give an idea of a student group-wise that might not feel comfortable. Could be family, and I'm talking about once they're here on campus or anything. Let's just open it up to anything. What could be a group? Family structure could be a problem. Could be a difficult thing depending on what their family structure is. What else might be a group?
Immigration status.
Immigration status might be a problem when it comes to group. I would actually call that institutional because there's rules and regulations that we have to live by when it comes to those that are undocumented. Just to give you an idea where I'm going with this. And I just pulled out just some examples. Some of them are examples of, get back there. I got the power. Some of them are really specific to institutions, and some of them aren't specific to institutions. So microaggressions, racial slurs. I gave you an example of that earlier. Group members, study groups that meet in a room that's not wheelchair accessible. The group hasn't even thought about those folks that might need access to get to that study group, yet they've invited them there and they can't make it, okay? Fraternity organizations not including queer members, or the Boy Scouts and their attitude towards gay and lesbians. Institutional, underage drinking, car rental. When I first moved here, my daughter, who at the time was 23 years old, wanted to come and visit me, but I didn't trust her car, so I told her to go rent one. Got a great deal on a car. $10 a day from Colorado to come here. But then I found out I had to pay $25 a day because she was only 23 years old. Didn't look at her driver's license, just looked at her age and said, you're too young. It cost me more for insurance than it cost me to actually rent the darn car, okay? And systemic. So can you come up with ways that get in the way of students being successful on a college campus that fit any of these categories? And the one I put up there too is limited campus training and focus. We've got to make sure we're broadening that focus and broadening the focus beyond the type of training that we're doing now. Okay? How many people had to do a module for ADA training? How many people had to do a module for discrimination and harassment? We've got to do those type of modules. From my perspective, we need to develop a module to increase our cultural competency and apply that module and have everybody do that module as well. And we're getting there, we're moving in that direction, but we're not there yet. But this just allows you as individuals, and you can do this within your own units, to find out what in your units is stopping students from being successful. What in your units is getting in the way of their success. I'm 57 years old. I've had a cell phone for 3 years, okay? And I didn't want to get one, but when I moved, I had to make sure I can keep contact with my kids. Sometimes, my point is, technology gets in the way. When we're constantly using technology in the classroom, and there's a place for technology, don't get me wrong, but how many students don't have access to technology? How many students live off campus and they've got to go to the library or come back to campus and stay till 10, 11 o'clock in order for them to get the work that they're done? How many adult learners do you have that really wants a hard copy of the schedule? Okay? They want that so they can thumb through it and see what they want to take. Sometimes those things are in the way of their success because we're gearing everything towards people that we think have access to technology, that have a laptop or something that they could use, that they can sit in their dorm or in their residence and actually apply it. And I'm not saying anything bad and anything wrong with technology, but we have to be careful how we use it because sometimes it serves as a barrier for their success. Just think of the students that are actually coming from poor neighborhoods and poor backgrounds that don't have access to it. Think of the adult learners, such as myself, they don't even know how to use it, okay? I had to call somebody into my office to put something together the other day because I have no idea how to use technology. Luckily, I've got Melody, who is fantastic, or else I would have been lost. It would have taken me a week to do what she did in like 10 minutes, okay? We've got to make sure that we understand that.
But it could go the other way around because we're used to technology in a certain way and we put stuff on the web that we don't realize that most students, they access only to their phones and what they put in their
That's
phone.
true. How many people have sent emails to their students and never got a response? Okay? And it's kind of interesting because when I was in St. Petersburg last week, I was a faculty member for a training, a week-long training for academic advisors. And for the first time, and I've been doing this is my 13th Summer Institute, an advisor from a campus brought their student peer advisors. First time ever. So we just really quickly got the 6 of them together and said, could you all sit on a panel so we can ask you questions? And I mean, they were open, they were honest. We learned so much from their hour-and-a-half panel, probably more so than we learned during the first 3 days of that conference. And we asked a question, how would you like to receive information? You know what they said? Email. They actually said email. And we were blown away going, what are you talking about, email? Nobody answers their email. And they said, well, I don't want my faculty member on my Facebook page, and I definitely don't want them texting me. So they had ideas of what they thought they wanted, which really blew us away because that's the last thing we ever thought. Actually, the student said, do you think we should create a Facebook? And she was really open. She was the cutest little thing, and she screamed out, oh my God, no! Okay? And everybody in the room went, well, then we've got to have a way to get this to you. But unless we ask, we don't know. And each population is really different. Each campus is really different in terms of the access to it. But we've got to understand our own population and what they actually prefer. But this chart just gives you an idea of where those barriers might be, because if you haven't identified them, what's my next statement? If you haven't identified them, how can you eliminate them? You can't. You got to know what the issue is. You've got to know what the concern is. You've got to know what the problem is. And you also have to know what they enjoy. But this just gives you a good idea from 4 different areas of things that you can identify from your own units and your own departments that might be getting in the way. When I first came here, the thing that really got in the way of the Office of Multicultural Affairs being successful is that people didn't know what it was. And if you stopped anybody and asked them what it was, they had no idea what it was. And the people that knew what it was and who it was for, what did they tell me? Oh, that's for students of color. That's the farthest thing from the truth. The Office of Multicultural Affairs is for every single student on this campus. Student fees pay for that office. They have every single right to utilize the programming, the facility, everything that that office has to offer. We had to actually be systematic in making sure that they understood that. And going to Student Senate and going to Greek Life and saying this office is for all of you. Even though it began in the 70s as an office for diverse students and still serves as that home away from home, the office is for all students. But that's not the impression that people had on campus. And it's not just here. Any multicultural affairs office in this country has that same invisible image that it's only for students of color. That served as a barrier for us getting other students through that door. So the best way to do it, make sure on Thursdays you got some cookies and some lemonade for students to come in and get. Food always brings them in, okay? Well, we had to do something structurally to get them in the office, okay? Isn't that a very true statement? A committed student and a motivated student is hard to stop. We've got to get them committed. So the personal relationships that we have and the support that we provide them, that's what motivates our students. And if we're not doing those things, they're not motivated. And some students are just self-motivated, but a lot of them are not self-motivated. They need us to light that fire, and they need us to fan that fire so it's still going. We've got to do those things in order for students to be successful, okay? I want you to take a look at this chart. I want you to find yourself. Where are you on that chart? Are you at non-awareness, or are you at intercultural skillfulness? And the chart is actually in the packets, I believe, as well. If you can't read that, it should be in the packets. I think I included that. But this gives you a good idea of, is it in there, sir? Yep. This gives you a good idea of where you're at. Identify where you're at. Where are you at in terms of your cultural competency? Where are you at in terms of your understanding of people that may be different from you, culturally, socially, whatever you want to define it as? And then find out where you're at on this chart. Everybody have a good idea of where they're at? And some people are tweeners. They're like in between, awareness of difference and acknowledgement. That's fine. I'm not going to ask anybody to tell where you're at, so don't worry about that. And the other thing that's important, not everybody wants to be here. Some people are really comfortable here. Some people are really comfortable here. And that's perfectly acceptable. Wherever your comfort level is where you should actually fall. My next question is, how do you move? Say you're at awareness of difference and you want to get to cultural adaptation. What are some steps that you can take personally to move down that chart? Should actually flip it around so I can say up that chart. Every time I say down that chart, people think it's negative. What are some things that you can do personally? The thing that it takes is this: intentional reflection. That's what it takes to move. So tell me how you can move. What can you do to change your status of where you're at from a cultural competency standpoint?
Educate yourself.
Educate yourself. Anybody in here not know how to use a library? Not know how to access databases? You can find anything in a database. I mean, anything. There's so much information out there. Make sure you utilize what the university has to offer in terms of that. You don't have to take a class, per se, but you got to take it upon yourself to educate yourself. So one thing you might do is read up on the cultures that you don't know. What else might you do?
Join in on the English conversation groups.
Join in on the English conversation groups. And English is having a conversation. When is it, Edgar? You're having a retreat to actually increase cultural competency. And English has taken it upon themselves. School of Education has had probably 5 retreats that I'm familiar with. They've taken it upon themselves. So as units, you can actually put together a session so you can have conversations and discussions with your fellow colleagues. Yes, sir?
Paying attention to your own thoughts.
Yeah.
If you sit quietly, you have to give yourself forgiveness
Yeah.
for thoughts that come through your
That's
head
right.
that you're not necessarily choosing.
And I'll pop them up there, and that's the one that people forget, and I'll explain it to you when I pop up my things that I would talk about. And I have a different title to it, but the same thing you're talking about. What else can you do? Anybody in here turn down free lunch? Take somebody that's different than you out to lunch. And just tell them, I really want to get to know your culture. I really want to get to know your identity. I really want to have these conversations so that you can also get to know me. Do that. What else can you do? Travel. There's so many students how many students do you know that have studied abroad and come back and said, that's the greatest experience of my life?
Absolutely.
And you got to know a different culture. And not everybody can.
I have a question.
That's why you raise your hand.
I have a question / challenge.
Okay.
I don't necessarily feel like it's the responsibility of others to educate us. And I
Okay.
feel like that can be an uncomfortable
Yes.
situation for the person who we're involving. So I would put a caveat to that
Yep.
to say that there's a relationship there and a comfort level there where you feel that that's appropriate.
Oh, yes.
Because I think bringing people into those conversations just because
Yep.
they are of a group can be
And you're
a microaggression.
I agree with you 100%, and I probably should have prefaced it by saying that. Don't just walk up to any black person and say, I want to take you out to lunch because I want to get to know your culture, okay? I see some black people in the room going, hell yeah, unless you're buying me food, okay? But you're absolutely right that you've got to make sure you've got a relationship with that person prior to actually doing that. You don't just approach somebody and run across the campus and say, oop, 12 o'clock, let's go out to lunch. Make sure you've got a relationship and make sure they understand what your intentions are. And I really appreciate you saying that because you're 100% positive, and I should have prefaced it by saying that. Other ideas? Travel? Coaching. There's so many students that coach different teams, so many students that work at the Boys and Girls Club that want to get to know them. I, in this room, do a talk for a journalism class every single fall semester. And those students have the responsibility of going out into the Lawrence community and making sure that they go to some type of institutional structure, some type of business, some type of organization to observe people that are different from themselves because they're eventually going to be reporting on different communities. So the last time I did it, a student raised her hand and she said, where can I learn about black people in Lawrence? Okay? Kind of a funny question. Where'd I send her? I sent her to the barbershop. And she came into my office 3 weeks later and swore to God she knew everything about black people in Lawrence because she sat in the barbershop for 3 hours. They talked about politics, and they talked about sports, and they talked about their children. There are institutional structures here in Lawrence that you can get to know other cultures as well. But you've got to take it upon yourself to actually do so. Personal interactions. Go to theater, film, and the arts. And this is the one I was talking about. I used to have students do intercultural journaling. So for 3 months, write down your interactions with people that are different from yourself. Write down how you felt, write down what they said, write down what you said, and then after 3 months, go back and look at it. And see if there's a pattern, see what exists, see if you've changed, see if you were appropriate or inappropriate. And people have come back and said they didn't realize some of the things they said, they didn't realize some of the interactions they were having, they didn't realize some of the conversations they could have had but didn't think about it. But they're writing it down so they can keep track of it and make sure that they understand that every time they do so, it gives them something to look back at to have a better idea of where they're at. Training programs, educational classes or books, and workplace activities. And this is just an example. When I was working at Colorado State University, I used to have students do something that they initially thought was really strange. But it really gave them a better idea of different cultures and different folks in terms of their interaction and how they interact with other people. What is the most segregated day of the week? Sunday. I sent my students to different churches. Sent them to a church. Not that I was trying to convert them. I sent them to other people's churches. And I did it myself first just to make sure that it was safe and comfortable for them. When I walked into a church that obviously they knew I didn't belong to, I walked into the Mennonites once. How did they react to me? Welcoming, come on, let us talk about it. Not that they're trying to convert me, because that wasn't their intention. Let us tell you about us, let us do this and that. And it was just this atmosphere that I never would have had the opportunity to actually do, even if you belong to the same religion. Anybody ever been to a white Baptist church? Anybody ever been to a black Baptist church? The white Baptist church is the frozen chosen, okay? They don't move, okay? If you're going to a black Baptist church, set aside about 4 hours, okay? And you're going to learn all kinds of different things, but it allows you to put yourself in situations that you normally would not be in. That's how we change. Because if we go about doing the same things we do on a regular basis, we're not changing. There's an old saying that says, as long as I live, I'm going to try and change because change is an indication of life. We want to make sure that we're living up to that and changing not just our physical appearance, but also changing our attitudes, changing our knowledge, changing how we interact with different folks, because those are the things that really make it worthwhile. Okay? Look at this chart. There's another way of looking at it too, that way. I think this one is more inclusive. What do we always focus on? The first ring, the second ring, or the third ring? when we talk about identities and we talk about different groups, what ring do we always focus on? We always focus here. Ethnicity, race, age, gender, sexual orientation, physical ability. We are a country of raceaholics. We really are. We inject it everywhere, even if it doesn't belong there, and we talk about it. Try to turn on the television and not see it. Everybody knows that there's a show that's coming on Wednesday night, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about it, called Blackish. Anybody see those advertisements? Yeah. Not quite sure how I feel about the show. I haven't seen it because it doesn't start, I think, till next week. But it's called Blackish. What is a black family like? Okay? What is a black community like? Okay, and they've got some pretty big stars that are actually starring in that show, and it's on, I think, ABC or NBC. It's on one of the main stations, okay? But we always focus on this. When we talk about identities, how come we're not focusing here? For some students, their parental status is more important. For some students, their personal habits are more important. For some students, their spirituality or educational background is more important. We need to make sure that we're looking at people in their totality and not just looking at them as an ethnic being. But we have a tendency to look at people simply as ethnic beings. And that's the end-all, be-all to that question. We've got to make sure that at any given point, all these identities can surface. Identities surface at different times. Anybody in here not have multiple identities? And I'm not talking about Sybil, okay? I'm talking about, when I say that to a group of young people, they got the strange look on their face like, who the hell is Sybil, okay? I'm not talking about Sybil. I'm talking about the identities that we go through all the time. We're parents, we're grandparents, we're mentors, we're colleagues, we're teachers, we're instructors, we're advisors, we're administrators. We go through those identities on a regular basis, but when we talk about students, we limit it to their students or their ethnic background. And I'm not talking about all the time, and I'm not talking about everyone, but we have a tendency to do that. And we should move away from that and allow their full personalities to actually surface, okay? Does it make sense, everybody? I told you my children are biracial. The only time I told them that it's absolutely mandatory that they claim that they're black is for scholarships, okay? Just kidding. But we want to make sure that we understand what's going on with them, and this is just another way to look at it, okay? So, everybody has those forms, and those that don't have the form, I want you to do something for me. Really simple. You've got the form. You can look at your neighbor, share, but I want you to fill it out, and you, if you don't, you can just follow along in your head. It's not that difficult of an exercise, okay? There are 7 blanks here. I want, in your head or on the paper, put down 3, 4, 5. You don't have to put down all 7. Put down 3 or 4 people, 5 people that have been influential to get you to where you are at today. And they cannot be family members. I know you already started. Everybody wants to put their family down, okay? I want you to put down 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 folks in your lifetime that have been influential to get to you where you're at, and put it down here. So if you've got 1, put it under the 1. You got 2, put it under the 2. You got 3, and so forth. Put down people that have been influential in your life to get you to where you're at today. However you define influence, you can define it as a mentor, in positive influences, by the way. You can define it as a mentor or something, but it can't be family members. We'll do it for positive, okay? We're going to keep this positive, all right? I did this exercise with a group of students not long ago, so I don't think I have to say it because you're all adults, but I'll say it anyways. They cannot be cartoon characters, okay? Somebody put down 3 cartoon characters. I'm not quite sure how Quick Draw McGraw allowed me to get to where I'm at today, but for some reason they thought that was acceptable. So just however many people you're comfortable with, 3, 4, allowed you to get to where you're at today, influenced you in a positive way, okay? Once you have those names down, as much as you can, as much as you know, I want you to identify them according to these categories underneath their name. Okay? I want you to identify them according to these categories under their name. This is the highest level of formal education that they have received when they influenced you. This is the age of the person when they influenced you. Okay? And not everybody's going to be older than you. Some people are the same age. Some people, as I described my son, were younger. I'll never forget what he said. Okay? So put down 3 or 4 people, 5 people. And then I want you to put down whatever you know. You might not know their religion. You might not know their sexual orientation of all the people that influenced you. But put down as much as you know about the folks that have actually influenced you. And you can use abbreviations. You don't have to write it out. I'm not going to check spelling. And this is for you. If you want to share, you can in just a second. If you don't want to share, this is for you. Don't worry about it. What is their race and ethnicity? By the way, does everybody know the difference between race and ethnicity? We'll have a different conversation over that at another time. But there is a difference. Everybody ever seen those forms that you fill out that says white, Hispanic, white, non-Hispanic? The United States government says anybody who's Hispanic is a Caucasian. So white is their racial category, Cuban is their ethnic category. Okay? Fill this out as much as you can. What is their race, their class, their gender, educational level, their ability. When I do exercises with adults, when we define ability, generally people that are in their 30s, 40s, they generally define ability as personal characteristics. You're intelligent, you're athletic. What do students define ability as? Able-bodied and non-able-bodied, because it's part of their language, it's part of their generation. So even that term, they've got a different definition than what most adults would use, especially adults outside of higher education. Okay? Give you another minute or so. Everybody got a few of them filled in? All right. Anybody see a pattern? Anybody see a pattern on their sheet? Don't be shy. Anybody care to share a pattern that you see on your sheet? Yes, ma'am. High education. What about racial or ethnic? White. So they all tend to be white. Okay. What about gender-wise? Predominantly women. Anybody else see a pattern? Yes, sir.
Educated white female.
Okay, educated white females. Anybody else care to share a pattern that they have? Yes, ma'am.
Educated white males.
Educated white males.
2 of my middle school teachers are African American
Where'd you go to school?
in South Carolina.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, Dutch went to school in Lawrence. Okay, there tends to be a pattern. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, didn't see your hand. Older than you? What is their racial category? What is their ethnic category?
They're all white.
Okay. What about religion? Assumed all Christians. When we do this type of exercise, and when I do this exercise, and I've probably done it 50 times, the sheet generally looks like us. It generally fits the same pattern that we have in our lives. Because we tend to be drawn. Anybody ever hear of the old book, Why Do All the Colored Kids Sit in the Cafeteria Together? It's an older book. They're asking that question because people are attracted to people that look like themselves. That when you take a look at it, these are the type of questions I would generally ask for people that would do this. Just processing questions. Did you notice a pattern? What surprises you the most? If someone picked up your paper, what would they think of you? If everybody was the same race, everybody was basically the same gender. I did this at a university in Illinois about 5 months ago, and one woman got really excited and she said, "Oh, mine's different." I said, "What ethnicity were they?" She said, "They're all Hispanic, but I've got 4 men and 3 women." But they all were Hispanic, they all were Catholic, they all were educated, they all were about the same age. So she saw that as a difference. I didn't see it as that much of a difference. My point here is that we need to be intentional in those that we reach out to mentor. Because we tend to be, and there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying that your sheet is wrong and it's bad. We need to be intentional of the folks that we actually reach out to mentor. Students that are in trouble. We shouldn't just have people that look like them serve as their mentors. Does that make sense to folks? Because people's sheets tend to look the same. They tend to look exactly like them. Maybe a couple shifts here and there, and I'll generally have 1 or 2 people that don't fit the pattern, generally because of where they're brought up. And generally, like Joni said, she was in South Carolina. We need to make sure that we're reaching out to folks that are different than us, that are in trouble, that need help, regardless of what their background is, regardless of what our background is. And I'm attracted to folks that are similar to me. I'm attracted to folks that make those same characteristics or have those same characteristics, but I also want to reach out to people that don't have those characteristics. That's also going to increase my cultural competency when I do so. Estelle?
I just want to point out that if you look at the faculty on March and I was saying, if you look at women in math, clearly all your mentors have not been women.
That's right. And it's because of that field of the study. And I do the same exercise for businesses and organizations when I do consulting, and they're always trying to diversify, just like campuses are, they're always trying to diversify their employees. But then they look at the sheets, and the sheets look just like them. And there's nothing wrong with this next term, but I hear it over and over again when I'm doing work with private businesses, well, they're a good fit. And then when I ask that next question, why are they a good fit? Well, they got the same characteristics that I have. That's not a good fit. A good fit would be having other characteristics, so you've got a variety of opinions and experiences at that table when you're discussing concepts. But sometimes you don't see it because, oh yeah, I can relate to that person. I got along with them really well in the interview because they had the same experience that you had. Ask different questions in that interview, then you're probably going to get different answers.
Yeah, but what I wanted to point out is that it's true that we have to reach students that are different from us, but from the sake of the students, we should tell them if they want to be successful in an environment where there are not many people that look like them who are successful, they should look for mentors.
It goes both ways.
Who are in that environment.
That's right.
So
Regardless of what they look like.
Right.
That's right. It goes both ways.
It helps students to make them say, okay, this is why they
That's
should
right.
reach to us.
And students have a responsibility in this process. And they also have a responsibility because students are going to leave campus, are going to go elsewhere. They're not always going to be around people that look like themselves. They're not always going to be able to reach out to those populations depending on where they end up in the country, depending on what their occupations are. They may not come into contact that look like themselves. And I'd hate for a student not to gain that experience while they're here and then go out into the working world and really be surprised about it. And really be shocked that there's nobody out there that looks like me that can help me. And there may be, there may not be, but we should give them options and choices across the board. But this just gives you an idea of why we're doing those type of things, and it gives you an idea of the things that we're not really conscious about that we're doing. Yes, ma'am.
One interesting pattern I found in mine is that I think on some level maybe that I'm projecting pieces of my identity because the one that I didn't know about people's religious affiliation and religion's not important to me personally.
So you never asked a question, never came up. You weren't concerned about it.
But it could have been very important to them, but it wasn't an aspect of them that I knew.
That's right. And there's a lot of aspects of people's identity that we don't know that we interact with on a regular basis. You know, we don't have those deep conversations about these with many people. We don't sit around the water cooler and talk about those identities. Maybe we should, but I know we don't to any great degree. Okay? Any questions about that activity? Partnerships. And when I say partnerships, I'm talking about building partnerships with students. The absolute, from my perspective, most important aspect of building partnerships with students or building partnerships with different units across campus. I know we've got a partnership with IOA, we've got a partnership with Silk, we've got a partnership with Emily Taylor, is making absolutely certain that we've got mutually agreed upon visions and goals. Because if we don't, then we're not doing the same thing. Not that some of theirs might be different and some of ours might be different, but overall we've got to have that. And I won't stay on this for too long, I just wanted to introduce it. Understand and appreciate another's work, ongoing communication, value and solicit from others. And I swear to God, those hands weren't in the way when I did this PowerPoint, okay? Create and implement a shared inclusive decision making. These are the things that we need to do for other units, and we do that on a regular basis for other units. Do it for admissions. We've got a really strong partnership with Greg Valdivino in the admissions department, but then we don't do the same things for students. We just think that automatically those partnerships are going to exist because of our title and our position on campus. They've got to be structured. They've got to be purposeful. We've got to be conscious of what we're doing in order to have those type of partnerships with those students. And all of these things are important. There's got to be. You can't have a partnership if you're not always talking, okay? And I'm talking about communication, which is both ways. It's not me talking to you, it's also you talking to me, so we both have that understanding of where we're coming from, okay? And we've got to have respect and trust. Go to this one. It's in your packet. This is really interesting. If you have it, you can participate. If not, you can talk about it when we get done. And I once again apologize. I had no idea this many people were going to show up, which is awesome, so I only made 50 copies. So, you got a partner, person next to you, okay? And how many people are sitting next to someone? Well, we won't do it that way because I can't, because we don't have enough people. But I'll tell you how this works. Generally, I'll have Edgar and Daniel work together. They think they know each other, and they understand each other. They're colleagues. I'll have Edgar fill out his personal wheel. No talking, no explanations, no definitions. I'll have Edgar fill out his personal wheel. He'll talk about individual characteristics. He'll talk about these things. The way I actually have used these in the past is for me to get to know students better. So when I was an academic advisor and the student was actually out in the office waiting for me, I'd have him fill out both sides. Because how long do we really talk to students? And we usually talk to students when they come to us for concerns or questions, but we really never get to know them. I also use this in my University 101 class, my PRE 101 class. So I'll have students pair up just like I would have had you pair up. So once again, Edgar fills this out on himself. Edgar doesn't ask any questions, no definition, no talking whatsoever. Oops, wrong button. Then turns around and fills out the social identity on Daniel. Daniel turns around, fills out the personal identity himself, then looks at Edgar, fills out his social identity. What you find out is a lot of people make assumptions. Anybody in the room not make assumptions? Okay? We make assumptions on a regular basis. In some categories, they're more difficult to fill out than others. But we make assumptions on students, we make assumptions on our colleagues. I did this training in Colorado Springs for a bunch of elementary teachers, and they found out that a woman that they've been working with for 15 years identified as Native American and was very actively involved in a Native American association to raise money for students to go to college. Never asked her the question. She didn't think they were interested. They never had that conversation or discussion because that was an identity that she didn't think other people had of her. But you want to do this so that you understand not only how you see yourself, but just as importantly, how do others see you? Anybody have children? I had my kids fill this out. Don't do that, okay? Okay? I filled out my personal wheel, and I was open, I was honest, I was approachable. Once again, my son Kyle, I was closed, and he even used the term anal, okay? But that's how he saw, and I had no idea that's how he saw me because I filled out that personal side. This is how I see myself. You fill out that social side, you may find out that people see you very differently than what you actually are. And when students do it individually, it's really interesting because they fill out both sides, and they don't match up sometimes. This is my personal image, this is my social image, and it does not match up at all, okay? So you want to make sure that you understand not only how you identify yourself, but even more importantly, how are your students identifying you? What do your students think of you? How would your students fill out those categories? And I always tell students, and this is an important piece, if there's something you're not comfortable filling out, do not fill it out. I would hate to have a student come out simply because I asked them to fill out this wheel when they hadn't come out any time in their lifetime. So always make sure you preface it and say if there's something you're really not comfortable with, simply leave that category blank. And I've yet to have a student say they didn't want to do this. I've yet to have any group that I've been interacting with say they didn't want to do it, but it gives you really good snapshots of how people are identifying themselves, from a personal side and a social side.
How about having the student feel that about you?
About me? Oh, Lord have mercy. Did you hear the question? She said, how about having everybody in this room fill that out on me, okay? That would be an interesting read tonight, now wouldn't it? Okay?
That would be good.
I would be more than willing to do that if everybody filled out one on Estella. I got no problem with that, all right? But we want to make sure that we understand what our images are that are out there. And some of them are really difficult. And when I say people make assumptions all the time. Under that social identity, people make assumptions about their spirituality. People make assumptions about people's race. I gave you an example of people thinking I was Puerto Rican. People make assumptions of people's age. Men, be really careful if you're filling it out with a woman. Guess low, okay? But people make assumptions all the time. And this is the most interesting one. I've probably done this exercise. I can't even count how many times I've done this. But I can count on one hand how many people put something down there other than middle class. Everybody thinks they're middle class. And it's just amazing that everybody thinks because, and I asked a group once why, so I had them shout out, give me characteristics of the working lower class. What'd they shout out? Anybody? We all want to be middle class. Anybody give me an example? They shout out that they're uneducated, that they're lazy, that they're dirty, that they're drug addicts. What do they shout out for the middle class? They're hardworking, educated, family-oriented, frugal, industrious. What do they shout out for the upper class? They're entitled. Actually, somebody once said, you ever hear that expression that you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth? A student once told me, you're born on third base, but you give yourself credit for hitting a triple. Okay? That's how they actually defined it. All right? What else do they shout out for that upper class? They're also lazy, and they're also drug addicts. Except they use powder cocaine. But they're still drug addicts. It was really interesting that they did that. Why wouldn't everybody want to be identified as middle class? What happens when we make an assumption for the students we're working with that they're all middle class? We may be asking them to do things that they cannot do on a regular basis. There's a lot of students here that we work with that can't afford books, but they're here. And they've got to share books with other people. Or they're hoping that their books are online, or they're hoping that their books are in the library, however they get access to it. But we've got to make sure that we understand that not everybody in society is middle class.
I have an example from the other side,
Okay.
which is we employed at the Writing Center a student who came from a very wealthy background and had reached the university without ever having worked before. And that was his first job.
Yeah.
He had no idea.
Then do you make an assumption
I did.
that he knows how to work?
No idea how to be an employee.
That's right. And we make those type of assumptions on a regular, and we can't stop that. I'm not saying this, go out here after this and don't make any assumptions. We're going to make those type of assumptions. Just be real careful of how we're making the assumptions. and be real careful what we're asking the people to do that we're making assumptions about. And it's really interesting too, when I have students of color fill this out for their social identity wheel, and it doesn't say who am I as an individual, if I have students of color, I would guess probably 40% of the time that it comes out in that middle 3, that, what's your name, ma'am?
Kelly.
Kelly. Kelly's not a strong woman. What is Kelly? She's a strong black woman. And I have students put that down. I've yet to have anybody say I'm a strong white woman, by the way. I'm not quite sure why, but they don't put it down. But I've had so many, and I'd say it's about 40% of people of color putting it down as a personal characteristic on their social identity. But that's how other people see them. Not necessarily how they see themselves, but that's how other people see them. And I automatically understand that when I'm working with the students that I'm working with, that that is either part of their identity or something that others think is a part of their identity. Either way, I need to know that, and I need to understand that if I'm truly going to be effective with the students that I'm working with. But it's just a quick exercise. It doesn't take very long to do. And then the most interesting thing is, and what I would have done, is had you talk to your partner about that social identity. And it's really enlightening how other people see you. Even people who have been working together for a long time learn things that they never learned and never knew about colleagues they've been working with in the same office for a long time. It just allows you, once again, to build those stronger relationships, to have a better understanding of where they're coming from, but also have a better understanding of how they identify themselves. Okay? Transitions and retention efforts. I'll just throw this up here real quick. Assessment of institutional commitment may be a proxy measure. When we talk about supporting students of color, how many of people worked at multiple institutions? And this isn't the only institution you've been at. Have all your institutions had some type of writing center, some type of counseling center, some type of tutoring, some type of supplemental instruction? I mean, almost every institution I've ever visited had those things, but the retention levels really vary. But they all have the same institutional structures. They all have the same programs. They all have the same offices, but it varies. Pell Grant, when they did the Pell Grant, what they talked about was sense of belonging. Are they part of the campus community? Are they have a sense of belonging on campus? And the second thing they came up with, people don't talk about very often. Scholars have found that students who have a positive race-related interaction experience feel a greater sense of belonging on campus regardless of what that campus is. Everybody see that second one? If they have a positive race-related interaction. Go back to that student from Niger. How did he feel? He had a very, very negative race relationship on his first month on campus. And all of a sudden, everybody did that. And one thing I didn't say to you, when he said he started to hate himself, the next thing he followed up with, I also started to hate white people. Not just that girl that was on that treadmill, but white people, because he lumped them all together, because he did not have a positive race-related interaction. And that can happen anywhere. It can happen anywhere on campus. It can happen when you're walking across campus. It can happen in a classroom. It can happen in an advising session. It can happen anywhere on campus. They've got to have that positive race-related interaction. And early social experiences in college are better determinants of initial levels of a sense of belonging than our demographics or academic experiences. It is the campus environment. That's what we need to be working at, to make sure everybody has a degree of cultural competency wherever they feel comfortable. But these are why people leave. It's not all about academics. It's about this and where they actually feel welcome and where they feel comfortable. So where do we go from here? Dominant group members. How many people in here belong to a dominant group? Raise your hand. Let me ask it again. How many people in here belong to a dominant group? Every single hand should go up. Because when we talk about it, and I asked you this question earlier, when we talk about privilege, what do we talk about? White privilege. How many people have been to a presentation on white privilege? Yes. And that's all we talk about. But privilege comes in a variety of different ways. And I do this with students so the students understand where their privilege is. And we don't have, what, 6 minutes or so I won't go over this. I just want to show you. I have students define who the dominant group is. I have students define who the subordinate group is. And generally, these are the categories right here. Those are the dominant groups. Those are the subordinate groups. Why did I put down under nationality perceived as?
Yeah.
Anybody? Why did I put that down there? Why isn't it just U.S. born, non-U.S. born? Why did I put perceived as?
How are you going to know unless you ask?
Okay, how are you going to know unless you ask them? What else? I was in Scottsdale, Arizona last August. I was at a summer institute. I was walking down the street because I wanted a cup of coffee by myself. Nobody else was on the street, partly because it was 110 degrees in Scottsdale in August. So I'm walking down to get a cup of coffee. Police officer pulled up, stopped me, and asked me I don't know how many questions. What are you doing? Where are you going? He even asked me how much money I had in my pocket. Why did he do that in Scottsdale, Arizona? Because I was not perceived as a US-born citizen, okay? And then I tell students that have filled this out, put an X where you are. Put an X if you're dominant in those categories, put an X if you're subordinate in those categories. And what do I generally find out from students? Anybody? They have more X's on the left-hand side than they have on the right-hand side. Yet, they're not using that privilege the way they should be using the privilege because it's race and ethnicity. It's race, 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 race. Once again, we're raceaholics. Students have other dominant characteristics. And we've got to understand how these dominant characteristics might get in the way of people feeling comfortable. And I'll give you 2 quick examples. Before I started to do this, I'd never thought about, what I did after work and when I walked to my car and so forth and so on. I knew where my car was. I made a beeline. I left. Okay? Ladies in the room, tell me if you had this experience. It's 10 o'clock at night. You get out of this building and you've got to walk down to the Mississippi garage by yourself. You take your keys and you put them between your finger. You make a beeline for your car. You unlock your car. You look in the back seat to make sure nobody's there. You get in the car. You close the door. You lock the door. You start it up and you're gone. Any women in here ever have that experience? Raise your hand. Any men in here ever have that experience? Raise your hand. I get maybe one guy that's had that experience. So I was coming out of the building one night, going through the garage, and I noticed a white student walking towards me at about 10:30 at night. And it was obvious that her body language had changed. So instead of me walking towards the car, which is directly behind her, I actually exited the garage on the first floor, walked all the way around so she didn't view me as a threat, even though I didn't know if she was viewing me or not, but I didn't want her to feel uncomfortable, and eventually went to my car. We can change our actions to make people more comfortable. I didn't want her to feel uncomfortable. I wasn't going to do anything to her, but she didn't know that. It was 10 o'clock at night. She was worried about her safety. And I wanted to make sure that she understood I was not a threat. And that's just a mild example. We can change any one of these. I hate to admit this, not this first part, but the second part. My aunt is lesbian, my daughter is a lesbian, and my sister is lesbian. So I thought, I'm the most open person in the world to gay students. In my former position, my administrative assistant, who I worked with for 15 years, pulled me aside one day, and she said, you're treating students very differently. I said, what are you talking about? She said, if you've got a gay student in your office, you're there for 5 minutes. I don't even hear anything come out of your office. And if you know me, generally students aren't there that short of a time. She said, if you've got straight students in there, you're in there for 40 minutes, 45 minutes, you're laughing, you're having a great time, and I didn't even realize I was doing that because I was letting my sexuality get in the way. I was letting it get in the way of me interacting with those students, so I had to do one of 2 things. I had to stop serving those students and assign them to another advisor, or I had to make adjustments so I felt comfortable with that population. So I went to the Lavender graduation, I presented during Gay Awareness Week, I made sure I was actively involved in that community so I could change my attitude because I wasn't doing those students a justice. And if I hadn't recognized that that was part of my dominant side, I never would have served those students the way I should have been serving those students. And I hate to admit it because I thought I was the most open person in the world, but obviously not. I still had a lesson to learn, and we all have those lessons to learn. We need to make adjustments so that whatever dominant characteristic, you can do your dominant characteristics in one of 2 ways. You can remove those as barriers to student success, or you can use those to help students to be successful. Either way, we've got to get into the habit of doing those things if we really want students to feel comfortable on campus. That's part of changing campus culture. That's part of changing the campus environment, or making those type of adjustments. And we need to make sure that we're aware of it. And if we're not aware of it, how can we make those adjustments? And just to mention this real quickly, this is the one that people generally get wrong. It's cisgender. How many people have never heard of cisgender? C-I-S-G-E-N-D-E-R. Cisgender means I'm born with male parts, I identify as being a male. That's dominant, as opposed to transgendered or transsexual. And even within the gay community, that population is discriminated against. Even within the gay community they are. So we've got to make sure we understand that as well, okay? And then this is just, I won't go over this because it's basically what I said and I'm running out of time. You can make adjustments. Adjust your behavior to reduce the negative impact. Work to influence members of your group to become more aware. Learn to partner and collaborate with people, not just of color, people that are different than yourselves. Learn how to do that. And claim and accept your own identity. We are a group society. Dominant groups have privilege, but also dominant groups are difficult to enter. Very difficult to enter. So we've got to make sure that we have that mindset where they can actually fully participate because once again, it's not about equality, it's about equity. and making sure that full participation and full opportunities are part of the equity that we want students to actually have here on campus. And not just students, but our fellow employees, our colleagues, and so forth and so on. We want to make sure that they feel comfortable as well. So the results is to recognize and promote inequalities to empower individuals so they can empower those around them. Just think of when you empower a diverse student, how many students do they talk to that are also diverse students? That can talk about those positive experiences they have and not the negative experiences they have. So students can serve as allies to also further the education and further the comfortability of other students that are actually here on campus. And we need to get students to think about this from day one. Not after they've taken a class, but from day one to create an inclusive environment so that they know that they're welcome here. We did a survey at an institution, and the question that they asked was just totally wrong in the survey. They said, do you belong on campus? Okay, that was their first question to diverse students. Do you belong on campus? You can answer that one of two ways. Yes, I belong on campus because the environment says I do so. And the other one is to hell with everybody else. I earned the right to be here. That's why I belong on campus. They had no idea what that result meant, but they took it as a positive. I said, unless you ask a more specific question, we don't know what that means in terms of do they belong on campus. We've got to make sure we understand the questions that we're asking so we can understand the results that we get. And lastly, guidelines for interaction. Once again, the very last one, that's why I highlighted it in red, is the most important. Consider the individual within a cultural context. Also consider the level of their cultural identity. Everybody know what the difference is between assimilation and acculturation? Acculturation is you haven't changed everything, you've just changed certain aspects of yourself. You haven't fully immersed yourself in other people's culture. We got to know, and that's part of that knowledge, it's part of that awareness, where are students in terms of this, okay? We've got to make sure that we understand that. And lastly, learn from them, allow them to tell their stories. We can learn from diverse populations as long as we give them a space to tell their stories. And we're open to hearing those stories. And not challenging those stories, but accepting those stories, okay? Establish good rapport, consider differences, and help-seeking behaviors and attitudes. That's how we become more culturally aware. That's how we become a more welcoming, not just campus. We shouldn't limit it to campus. That's how we become a more welcoming society. A more welcoming culture from coast to coast, so that people are comfortable regardless of who they are or how they identify themselves. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. If there's any of those forums that you think might be useful in any of the trainings you do with your departments or units, by all means just send me an email. I've got them electronically and I'll send them to you. And once again, anybody have any final questions or statements before we actually dismiss? And I told Cody that next time he does this, he should provide lunch for all you folks too, because you took it over your lunch hour, okay? And I really appreciate you taking time out, and thank you all very, 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 very much, okay?